During World War II, the heirs of the high-ranking Nazi officials grew up in an isolated environment where the reality of the conflict and its consequences were far removed from their daily perception. Brigitte Hoss, daughter of Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, remembered her childhood in that place as an idyllic time. For her, the rows of prisoners in striped suits working in the garden were nothing more than part of the daily landscape. Rolf Mengele, after a meeting with his father in 1977, confessed, "I will never understand how human beings could behave in that way." After Josef Mengele's death in 1979, he rejected his inheritance, abandoned his surname, and settled in Munich as a lawyer. Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, never hid his disdain for his father. In his book, My Father, A Reckoning, he described Hans as an unrepentant criminal responsible for the deaths of millions. What really happened to the heirs of the high-ranking National Socialist leaders? Hans Frank and Nicholas, inheriting horror, breaking the silence. It is not surprising that many sons and daughters of Nazi leaders justified their parents' actions. Raised in protected and privileged environments, they enjoyed an idyllic childhood in Nazi Germany, where they were treated with affection and respect. They had access to the best toys and a life of comfort, unaware of the atrocities their parents committed. For them, the same parents who told bedtime stories or took them on walks could not possibly be responsible for the deaths of millions, despite overwhelming evidence. In this context, speaking out against Nazism and condemning their own family legacy required extraordinary courage. Nicholas Frank was one of the few who did so. The youngest son of Hans Frank and Brigitte Herbst, he was born on March 9, 1939 in Munich. At just 8 months old, his father was appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he implemented policies of enslaving Polish citizens and the systematic extermination of Jews. Nicholas spent his childhood in Krakow, then unaware of the magnitude of the decisions that would define his family's dark legacy. Obsessed for years with his father's execution, hanged on October 16, 1946, after being convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials, Nicholas Frank dedicated his life to reconstructing the dark family history. Unlike his 4 siblings, he was the only one who sought answers to childhood memories and the conversations he overheard. Over time, his rejection of the environment he grew up in became absolute. "I hated that man who, even dead, continued to control me like a puppet. As a child, I knew I belonged to a family of criminals." Nicholas Frank's statements in his book, My Father, A Reckoning, generated a storm of reactions, especially within his family. His brother Michael furiously responded in a letter published in the Stern Weekly, while his other siblings denied the family's past. Only Nicholas and Norman assumed historical responsibility for their legacy. Sigrid, the eldest, emigrated to South Africa in 1966, where she defended apartheid. Brigitte took her own life in 1981, and Michael died at 53. Plagued by health issues and personal torments. A family fractured by guilt, silence, and the weight of an irredeemable surname. Over the years, Nicholas's initial shame toward his father turned into deep hatred, fueled by decades of research into Hans Frank's life, the Butcher of Poland. A respected journalist, Nicholas not only exposed the horrors of Nazism in documentaries, but also stated that his father deserved to be executed, feeling relief at his death. He also questioned his father's final conversion to Catholicism, convinced it was merely a superficial attempt at absolution. Although he despised Hans Frank, Nicholas admitted he had inherited his father's eloquence, cunning, and a biting sense of humor. The publication of the book sparked severe criticism among descendants of other Nazi leaders. Klaus von Schirach and Martin Adolf Bormann condemned its brutal tone, while Bormann, then a theology professor, regretted not having spoken to Nicholas about their family experiences. For many, questioning their parents was inconceivable. For others, Nicholas's work was seen as an excessive attack, both in tone and content. The personal cost was high. His siblings cut all contact with him, as did childhood friends unable to confront such an uncomfortable truth. Nicholas regretted never confronting his mother about her actions during the war. He described her as a cynical and frivolous woman, fascinated by the luxury of fur coats and being chauffeured in a Mercedes-Benz escorted by SS members. According to him, his mother often went to the local market, accompanied by an SS driver, to buy corsets made by Polish Jews who, weakened by hunger and misery, were forced to sell their products at pitiful prices. During World War II, the majestic halls of Wawel Castle in Krakow, a symbol of Polish national identity, became Brigitte Frank's domain. Brigitte's rise began with her marriage to Hans Frank, a lawyer who quickly ascended the ranks of the Nazi Party. In 1939, when Hitler appointed her husband as Governor-General of Poland, Brigitte saw an opportunity to consolidate her status and satisfy her insatiable taste for opulence. The couple moved to Wawel Castle, where Brigitte redecorated the rooms with looted artwork and furniture. Her new lifestyle earned her the nickname the Queen of Poland among the Nazi elite. Additionally, she is credited with actively participating in the plundering of Jewish properties, seizing jewelry, art, and other valuables, thereby contributing to the systematic eradication of Jewish culture in occupied territories. Brigitte's influence over Hans Frank was not limited to the domestic sphere. She encouraged him to implement increasingly harsh policies in Poland, ensuring that his administration maintained the favor of Hitler and other top-ranking officials of the regime. Her ambition and thirst for power were factors that drove Hans to harden his governance, deepening reprisals against the Polish people. However, after Germany's defeat and the revelation of Nazi crimes, Brigitte Frank denied any knowledge of concentration camps or the massacres committed under her husband's command. During the Nuremberg trials, where Hans Frank was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, Brigitte desperately tried to defend him, portraying him as a victim manipulated by Hitler. Hans's execution marked the beginning of Brigitte's definitive downfall. Stripped of power and the luxuries she had grown accustomed to, she spent her final years facing the consequences of her actions. Deprived of her influence, she lived in poverty in Munich until her death in March 1959. Silence and hatred, the heirs of Rudolf Höss. Brigitte Hoss, the youngest daughter of the infamous Auschwitz commander, Rudolf Höss, spent her childhood in the grim surroundings of the concentration camps. From her birth, her life was tied to the Nazi regime, moving from one residence to another in places like Dachau and Sachsenhausen before relocating to Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss, considered one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, was promoted to commander of Auschwitz in recognition of his efficiency. Despite his role in some of history's most atrocious crimes at home, he presented himself as a loving father. Along with his wife Hedwig and their 4 children, Klaus, Heidetraud, Inge Brigitte, Hans-Jürgen and Annegret, Rudolf settled in a comfortable house with a garden and swimming pool, located just 200 meters from the gas chambers. Built in 1937 by a Polish family, it was confiscated in 1940 by German authorities and assigned to Höss when he assumed control of the camp. Höss transformed the residence into a personal retreat. He expanded the structure, colonized the attic space, and turned the garden into an idyllic setting where his family lived with disturbing normalcy. While the children played and the adults sunbathed in the garden, the sounds of the camp, screams, German orders, and the constant noise of crematorium ovens were ignored or deliberately silenced in their minds. In 2007, historian Ian Baxter documented the home's interior, preserved almost intact. The wooden floors, original green tiles, and handcrafted fittings had survived the years, reflecting a state of minimal maintenance but sufficient to prevent its ruin. In 2011, BBC reporters visited the villa with Hoss's grandson, filming the garden, still green and well-maintained, as well as a trellis that resembled the barred gate bearing the inscription Arbeit macht frei. With the fall of the Third Reich, Rudolf Höss and his family attempted to flee north, taking refuge in the forests alongside other prominent Nazi families. Although he contemplated collective suicide, he refrained, considering his children. Eventually, he was captured in 1946, tried at Nuremberg, and executed the following year. During his imprisonment, Höss was interviewed by specialists seeking to understand his mind. He described with cold apathy the extermination methods used at Auschwitz, stating that he never questioned the orders he received, considering their fulfillment a necessity. He depicted himself as a solitary man, incapable of forming close relationships, and denied feeling guilt, though he admitted after the surrender that what he had done was not as he had been led to believe. Psychologist Gustav Gilbert characterized him as intellectually normal but profoundly insensitive, with an apathy bordering on psychopathy. Primo Levi described him as an empty man whose blind obedience provided comfort against his doubts. In his memoirs, Hoss reaffirmed his loyalty to National Socialism and portrayed himself as misunderstood, insisting that despite everything, he had a heart. After Rudolf's death, the Hoss family sought to leave the past behind and avoided mentioning the events that had marked them, aiming to start anew. However, they faced immense difficulties along the way. Food shortages, the need to steal coal to fight the cold, and the lack of footwear were part of their harsh reality. From then on, Hedwig, Klaus, Heidetraud, Ingebrigit, Hans-Jürgen, and Annegret were never the same again. At the war's end, each member of the Hoss family took different paths. Hedwig decided to rebuild her life in Germany, where she remarried. Later, she emigrated to the United States with her new husband. Although little is known about her life, it is reported that she lived peacefully in Washington until her death, with debates over her exact age, 81 or 90 years. Meanwhile, Klaus, the eldest son, assumed responsibility for supporting the family during difficult times before moving with his German wife, known as Lilo, to Australia. The couple settled in Sydney, where they raised their daughter, Christine. However, their marriage ended in divorce. Klaus passed away in the 1980s, a victim of liver cirrhosis caused by excessive alcohol consumption. For Brigitte, her father's death marked the beginning of a life of poverty and secrecy. In 1950, seeking to leave behind the weight of her surname, Brigitte emigrated to Spain. Thanks to her beauty and elegance, she secured work as a model for the prestigious Balenciaga house in Madrid. During those years, she never spoke of her origins. In 1961, she married an Irish-American engineer, and together they started a family. Throughout their marriage, they lived in countries as diverse as Liberia, Greece, Iran, and Vietnam, following her husband's career. Eventually, they settled in Washington, D.C. It was then that Rudolf Höss's memoirs came to light, revealing chilling details about his role in the Holocaust. Though this revelation could have haunted her, Brigitte shared her story with her husband, who showed empathy, considering her a victim of circumstance. Her life shifted from luxury and privilege to extreme poverty overnight, yet she managed to rebuild her identity far from the shadows of her past. For decades, Brigitte kept her story silent. In the United States, she worked in high-end boutiques, including Saks Jandel, earning the trust of her employers, who were unaware of her connection to the Auschwitz commander. On one occasion, she revealed her secret after a night of drinking, but it was met with understanding from both her boss, a Jewish woman who had fled Germany, and her colleagues. In 2013, at 80 years old and facing terminal cancer, Brigitte agreed to give a single interview to journalist Thomas Harding. Harding was seeking information about his great-uncle Hans Alexander, who had captured Rudolf Höss after the war. In the interview, Brigitte recounted her childhood, the days when soldiers raided her home, and her struggle to maintain anonymity. She feared reprisals and had always avoided burdening her children and grandchildren with the weight of her story. Like many descendants of Nazis, Brigitte lived at the crossroads between love for her father and condemnation of his actions. Though she kept a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, describing it as a memory of simpler times, she continued to question the numbers and details of the Holocaust. However, she accepted the reality of the atrocities and acknowledged her father's central role in the machinery of extermination, the legacy of shadows, the fortunes that survived the Third Reich. The Nazi regime spanned 12 years, from Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933 to his defeat at the end of World War II. Although many of its principal leaders were prosecuted and some executed in the Nuremberg trials, numerous German fortunes that prospered through alliances with the regime remained intact, to the point that some of these families are still among the wealthiest in the country. BMW, Volkswagen, Bayer, Porsche, Hugo Boss. These well-known companies share a dark historical connection to the Nazi regime. Several of them, supported by the SS, established concentration camps near their facilities during World War II. However, the fate of the wealth accumulated by these families after the fall of the Third Reich remains a less explored topic. The connection between these families and the Nazi regime originates from a confidential meeting held in Berlin in February 1933. Adolf Hitler, newly appointed as Chancellor, summoned around 20 prominent businessmen to secure their financial support for the National Socialist Party's campaign. Although some, like Quandt, considered him an unimpressive leader as recorded in their writings, they decided to support him. Years later, most would claim they were forced to join the Nazi cause due to the suffocating atmosphere of the Third Reich. During this period, many businessmen benefited from a process known as Aryanization, which involved the forced acquisition of Jewish property and businesses at ridiculously low prices. August von Fink seized Austrian banks such as Rothschild and Dreyfus, among other examples. What marked these individuals as war criminals, however, was their use of slave labor. Millions of deportees were forced to work under inhumane conditions. Gunther Quandt exploited nearly 60,000 people in his factories, while at Volkswagen's plant more than 10,000 prisoners were forced to build the people's car. Despite these atrocities, and although the post-war period in Germany included a phase of denazification, only one of these 5 major businessmen, Friedrich Flick, was tried by the Nuremberg Tribunal. Other businessmen, such as Quandt and Porsche, served brief prison terms but managed to retain most of their assets, except for those confiscated in the Soviet-controlled zone. Friedrich Flick, for his part, was sentenced by an American tribunal to 7 years in prison for the use of slave labor and the looting of a factory in France. In 1950, Flick was released after receiving a sentence reduction for good behavior. After Hitler's fall, Friedrich Flick, the richest man in Germany during the 1930s, was on the verge of losing everything. However, he not only managed to keep his properties, but by 1960 had reclaimed his position as the wealthiest person in the country, thanks to his majority control of Daimler-Benz, the manufacturer of Mercedes. When he died in 1972, he remained one of the richest figures in the world, rubbing shoulders with names like Jean-Paul Gaultier and the King of Saudi Arabia. Like Flick, other figures such as Herbert Quandt and Ferry Porsche managed to restructure their businesses and consolidate their legacies. Hidden Fortunes, the Nazi legacy of the Quandts. In the spring of 1945, Harold Quandt, a 23-year-old officer in the German Luftwaffe, was held captive by Allied forces in Benghazi, a port city in Libya. There, he received a farewell letter written by his mother, Magda Goebbels. In the handwritten message, the devastating news Harold had heard weeks earlier was confirmed. His mother had taken her own life alongside her husband on May 1st, after administering cyanide capsules to her 6 children in Adolf Hitler's underground bunker in Berlin. Dear son, it has now been 6 days since your father, your 6 younger siblings, and I came to the Führer bunker to give our National Socialist lives the only dignified end possible, she wrote. Harold, dear son, I want to pass on to you what I have learned in life. Be loyal. Loyal to yourself, loyal to the people, and loyal to your country. In 1918, Gunther Quandt's first wife passed away, leaving him a widower with 2 young sons, Helmut and Herbert. In 1921, he married Magda Ritschl, with whom he had a single child, Harold, born the following year. In 1927, Helmut died from complications related to appendicitis. Quandt and Magda separated in 1929, and 2 years later, she married Joseph Goebbels. In 1933, Gunther Quandt joined the Nazi Party and transformed his factories into key suppliers for the German war machine. According to Joachim Scholtisek, a history professor in Bonn and author of a study commissioned by the family on Quandt's role in the Third Reich, he was one of the most prominent industrialists of the Nazi regime and the Second World War. Harold, Quandt's youngest son, lived with his mother Goebbels and his 6 half-siblings. In 1939, following the invasion of Poland, he joined the German army and volunteered for the paratrooper division the following year. In 1944, he was wounded in combat and captured in Italy, subsequently being transferred to a British prisoner of war camp in Benghazi. During his captivity, Harold received both a farewell letter from his mother and a message from his stepfather, who wrote to him, "It is likely that you are the only one capable of keeping our family tradition alive." Quandt regained his freedom in 1947. 7 years later, alongside his half-brother Herbert, since Harold was the only surviving child from Magda Goebbels' first marriage, he inherited the vast industrial empire created by their father, Günther Quandt. Günther Quandt passed away in 1954 while vacationing in Cairo. His business empire was inherited by his two surviving sons, Harold and Herbert. Among the most valuable assets they received was a 14% stake in Daimler, of which they owned 4/5, according to the biography. Ricardo Eichmann, from buried past to global justice. Adolf Eichmann, a key figure in the implementation of the Holocaust, was born in 1906 in Solingen. Known for his precision and organizational skills, he rose quickly through the ranks of the SS. By the outbreak of World War II, he already held a prominent position, tasked with coordinating the logistics of mass deportations to extermination camps. Although he rarely visited the camps in person, he was the architect behind the complex bureaucratic machinery that enabled the systematic murder of millions of European Jews, following directives established at the 1942 Wannsee Conference. In 1944, when German troops occupied Hungary, Eichmann moved there to accelerate the implementation of the final solution. However, as Soviet forces encircled Budapest later that year, he fled to Berlin, dedicating his final efforts to destroying evidence that could incriminate him. After Germany's defeat in May 1945, Eichmann was briefly captured by American forces. Using the alias Otto Eckmann, he managed to escape. Aware that the Nuremberg trials and witness testimonies, such as those of Auschwitz commander Rudolf Höss, could seal his fate, Eichmann realized he had to disappear completely to avoid justice. In 1948, Adolf Eichmann, using the false name Ricardo Clement, obtained forged documents through a support network led by Bishop Alois Hudel. Taking advantage of the so-called monastery route, he fled to Italy and eventually departed for Argentina. There, he settled in the suburban neighborhood of Olivos in Buenos Aires, adopting a life of apparent normalcy. He secured a job at the Mercedes-Benz plant, gradually rising to the position of department head. His family joined him shortly thereafter. His wife and 3 older sons, Klaus, Nicholas, and Horst Adolf, reunited with him in Argentina. In 1955, his 4th son, Ricardo, was born. Ricardo grew up knowing nothing of his father's dark past. Eichmann worked hard to maintain a low profile, aware that his involvement in the Holocaust made him a target for Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. However, his anonymity did not last. In 1960, during Operation Garibaldi, Mossad agents located him in Buenos Aires. After capturing him, they secretly transported him to Jerusalem, where he stood trial for crimes against humanity. By then, Ricardo Clement was nothing more than a crumbling facade. The trial concluded with a death sentence, and his ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea. Young Ricardo, just 5 years old at the time, did not understand his father's absence, nor receive any explanation about his fate. Years later, upon discovering the truth, he faced the weight of a legacy filled with horror. He grew up struggling with the reality that his father had been a key figure in one of history's greatest atrocities, striving to reconcile his own identity with an unerasable past. As he delved deeper into the truth, Ricardo Eichmann developed a strong rejection of his father's legacy and Nazi ideology. He chose a radically different path, dedicating his life to academia. In the 1970s, he studied prehistory, classical archaeology, and Egyptology at the University of Heidelberg, specializing in the latter discipline. He participated in significant excavations in Egypt, a country not far from where his father had been executed. From 1996 to 2020, he served as director of the Orient Department at the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin, establishing himself as a respected scholar in his field. In 1995, Ricardo agreed to an interview with Zvi Aharoni, the Mossad agent who captured his father. While the details of their conversation were never disclosed, Ricardo later admitted that the experience was deeply revealing. With few public statements over the years, Ricardo Eichmann has consistently rejected his father's beliefs and preferred that his life be defined by his academic work rather than the legacy of Adolf Eichmann. The Eichmann story in Argentina did not end with Ricardo. Adolf Horst, the 2nd son, had a relationship with Carmen Beatriz Bretin Lindemann, a young woman from Misiones known as La Gringa. Together, they lived in Buenos Aires and had a daughter, Veronica Eichmann, who currently resides in Misiones. Carmen Lindemann, a textile entrepreneur and local figure, defended the German perspective on the Holocaust in interviews, referring to Adolf Eichmann as the grandfather. She denied the genocide scale and supported revisionist views. Adolf Eichmann left an indelible mark on world history and the lives of his descendants. While Klaus and Horst Adolf perpetuated their father's ideological legacy, Ricardo broke with that past. Ricardo Eichmann never shared his anguish with his brothers and maintained contact with only one of them. When asked what his siblings thought of him for speaking openly about the family's past, he replied, "If you want to know what they think, it's better to ask them yourself." His distance was evident, and when shown a photograph of his older brother, Horst, wearing an SS uniform in his youth, the reasons became clearer. As a teenager, Ricardo envied other children whose fathers had died in accidents or from illness. To him, at least those children knew the truth about their families. At 13 or 14, he recalled the moment he opened a magazine and saw a striking image, the noose that hanged his father after the trial in Israel. It was in that instant that he fully grasped who Adolf Eichmann had been and the burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Rolf Mengele, the burden of a name. In June 1985, the head of Brazil's forensic police, Romão Tuma, confirmed a shocking discovery. The human remains found on a beach in 1979 belonged to Joseph Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death. This Nazi doctor, responsible for horrific crimes at Auschwitz, had evaded justice for decades, hiding in South America in an attempt to erase his dark past. Mengele, who served as chief physician at the extermination camp, was obsessed with the idea of racial hygiene, a concept he used to justify his sadistic experiments. He believed his work would help prove the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Twins, in particular, became his primary subjects, whom he treated with the same indifference one might have toward laboratory rats. His experiments included surgeries without anesthesia, amputations of healthy limbs, injections of deadly diseases, and the deliberate infection of wounds. All of this was done to study the response of inferior human bodies to extreme pain and suffering. Josef Mengele escaped Auschwitz just 10 days before its liberation by the Red Army. He began a desperate flight westward, and though he was captured shortly after, his identity remained hidden. Presenting himself under the false name Josef Memling and lacking the SS blood group tattoo, he went unnoticed. He was released as a simple physician and continued his journey into hiding. Initially, Mengele joined a German unit moving toward Bavaria in the American-controlled zone. He was captured again and sent to the Schauenstein prisoner of war camp near Nuremberg, where he reunited with Dr. Kahler, a former colleague. After his release, Mengele returned to Auschwitz to retrieve his field notes, documents he considered vital to his pseudo-scientific legacy. From there, he crossed into Italy and reached Genoa in 1949. There, under the name Helmut Gregor, he obtained a passport issued by the Red Cross and set sail for Argentina. In July 1949, Mengele arrived in Buenos Aires and settled in the suburb of Vicente Lopez. He began a seemingly normal life, working as a carpenter and later as a salesman of agricultural equipment. Initially confident that global attention on Nazi crimes had waned, he lived under his real name for a time. However, in 1958, he was questioned by Argentine authorities on suspicion of practicing medicine without a license after a young woman died during an abortion. Although no charges were filed, the incident alerted him to the risk of being discovered. Seeking greater security, Mengele moved to Paraguay in 1959, where he obtained citizenship under the name José Mengele. He later settled in Brazil but made a significant trip to Europe beforehand. Using a passport issued by Argentine authorities, he traveled to Switzerland to meet his son Rolf, who did not know the man he met was his real father. Introduced as Uncle Fritz, Mengele shared a family vacation with Rolf, including a skiing trip. The young man enjoyed their time together, entirely unaware that he was in the company of one of history's greatest war criminals. Rolf would not see his father again until 21 years later, in 1977. The initial contact came through Josef Mengele's lawyer, Hans Sedlmayr, who located Rolf in Germany. Sedlmayr first arranged a meeting between Rolf and his cousin Karl-Heinz. who had lived with Mengele for several years in Argentina. Before the encounter, Sedlmayr sought to prepare Rolf, explaining that his father's generation, shaped by the direct experience of war, had a vastly different perspective on the Third Reich compared to younger Germans who knew it only through history books. Sedlmayr also had a practical motive. He needed Rolf to send money to his client, something they deemed essential for keeping Mengele safe. The Sedlmayrs, always loyal to Josef Mengele, acted as his principal defenders. Following Sedlmayr's instructions and determined to reunite with his father, Rolf traveled to Brazil using a borrowed passport, obtained by deceiving a friend during a vacation. Nothing could deter him from his goal of seeing Josef one last time, though his perception of him had profoundly changed. The elderly Mengele was no longer the childhood hero Rolf had once idealized. On the contrary, their differences were irreconcilable. Rolf, with communist leanings, clashed sharply with his father's ideologies. The meeting was marked by the emotional distance accumulated over the years. Rolf took considerable risks to meet the man who, during his childhood, had shown little interest in him, too preoccupied with his dark experiments under the Nazi regime. During Rolf's adolescence, Mengele was constantly on the run, evading Nazi hunters and Allied authorities. That reunion in Brazil was the last time Rolf saw his father alive. Shortly thereafter, Josef Mengele vanished forever. It is believed that Mengele died in anonymity, and his remains were buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in southern Brazil, leaving behind a legacy of atrocities that could never escape the judgment of history. Gudrun Himmler, the National Socialist princess. Throughout her life, Gudrun Berwitz granted only one interview in 1959 at the age of 30. On that occasion, she declared that her purpose was to change the historical perception of her father. "Today, my father is considered the greatest genocidal murderer of all time. I want to try to modify that view," she stated. Gudrun was married to Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, an activist in far-right movements and a member of the ultra-nationalist National Democratic Party of Germany. Gudrun dedicated her life to glorifying her father's image and questioning the documented horrors of the concentration camps. In her memoirs, she mentioned the gardens where prisoners cultivated vegetables and the landscape paintings created by some detainees. Although Heinrich Himmler had 3 other children, Gudrun was the only one born within his marriage. One of his children was adopted, and the other 2 were the result of his relationship with his personal secretary, with whom he had a long affair. As a child, Gudrun would plead with her mother not to tell her father about her mischief or silliness. She feared deeply disappointing him. As she grew older, that admiration for her father transformed into a firm conviction of his innocence. She was certain he had never committed the crimes of which he was accused, and considered his condemnation a complete injustice. For years, she dreamed of writing a book to rehabilitate his name, but never with the intent of defending him, as for her, that would imply accepting his guilt. Gudrun always believed that one day her father would be remembered in the same way as historical figures like Napoleon, Wellington, or Moltke. That hope became the guiding force of her life. History, however, condemned him forever. On Wednesday afternoons, her father would take her with him on inspection tours. One of those locations was Dachau, Germany's first concentration camp, inaugurated in March 1933 and located a few kilometers from Munich. He himself had overseen its creation. "Those wearing a red triangle are political prisoners. The ones with the black triangle are common criminals," he explained. To the young girl, they all looked the same, unkempt, with worn clothing and unshaven faces. However, what captured her attention the most were not the men behind bars, but the camp's vegetable garden and greenhouse. "My father talked to me about the importance of the plants they cultivated there. He even let me pluck a few leaves," she recalled years later. She was 12 years old during that macabre visit. The garden reminded her of her childhood on the farm, where she used to help her mother tend the garden. Gudrun watched her father's rise with admiration and pride. In August 1943, she recorded her excitement in her diary. "Daddy is the Reich's interior minister. I'm ecstatic." To her, her father was an important and prestigious man, worthy of admiration. Meanwhile, Himmler, in his role within the regime, displayed chilling detachment. In July 1942, during a trip to Auschwitz to supervise the implementation of the final solution with the mass use of Zyklon B gas, He wrote to his wife with complete indifference, "Off to Auschwitz, a kiss, your Heine." His letters, devoid of emotion or any detail about his activities, never mentioned the atrocities he witnessed or directed. He limited himself to expressing how exhausting his tasks were and the weight of his work, never revealing the horror hidden behind those simple, everyday words. Years later, Himmler justified his crimes with terrifying coldness. "I did not feel I had the right to allow Jewish women and children to survive, for those children would grow up to be avengers and would kill our children and grandchildren. That would have seemed cowardly to me. Therefore, the decision was clear." This is not just the story of Gudrun, the daughter of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the fanatical and absolute leader of the Third Reich's repressive apparatus. In his childhood, those who knew Heinrich said he was not even capable of crushing a fly. As an adult, this same timid man transformed into the principal architect of the Gestapo and the SS, playing a central role in creating the concentration camp system and orchestrating the extermination of Europe's Jews. In 1927, during a train ride from Munich to Berchtesgaden near the Austrian border, Heinrich Himmler met Margarete Sigroth Boden, who would later become the mother of his daughter Gudrun. Margarete, known as Marga, was a divorced nurse, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and Protestant, embodying the ideal Aryan woman promoted by the regime. Himmler, on the other hand, was 27 years old, physically frail, nearsighted, and had a weak chin, traits that distanced him entirely from the Aryan prototype he so exalted. His appearance filled him with insecurities, and his fragile constitution prevented him from participating in sports or enjoying grand banquets. This frustrated soldier found solace in discipline and the uniform, which provided him with a sense of order and control. A staunch advocate of sexual abstinence, Himmler had few relationships with women in his youth, and experienced his first intimacy at the age of 28. To win Margaret's favor, Himmler offered her books on Freemasonry and Jewish conspiracy theories, topics that resonated with the tensions of a Germany devastated by economic crisis and latent anti-Semitism. Marga, influenced by these ideas, had no hesitation in sharing discriminatory opinions. "A Jew is always a Jew," she said of her business partner when selling her share of a clinic after meeting Himmler, reflecting the climate of hatred that would define their relationship and their role in history. Heinrich Himmler, shy and insecure, wrote romantic letters to Margarete, whom he called "your Landsknecht." They married in 1928, although his conservative Catholic family rejected Marga for being Protestant, divorced, and socially awkward. In 1929, their only legitimate child, Gudrun, was born, affectionately nicknamed Puppy. Unable to have more children, they adopted a boy, but Marga considered him problematic and sent him to a boarding school. After studying agronomy, Himmler invested Marga's dowry in a chicken farm, which quickly failed. Margarete, isolated and depressed, was left in charge of the farm while Himmler distanced himself, occupied with his duties in the Nazi Party. In 1933, they sold the farm and moved to Munich. There, Himmler rose rapidly, becoming head of the German police in 1936 and developing an obsession with racial purity. The family later relocated to Tegernsee, but Himmler's responsibilities kept him away most of the time, exacerbating tensions with Margarete. Meanwhile, Gudrun became the model child of the family, adored by her parents. Heinrich Himmler grew increasingly interested in the role of sexuality in society, as he grappled with his inability to have more children with Margarete, whom he did not blame for the situation. He developed the idea that monogamy was a creation of the Catholic Church that needed to be abolished. According to his arguments, based on Germanic prehistory, a nobleman could take a second wife if it guaranteed more children. This philosophy also influenced SS policies, allowing officers to divorce or live with second wives. In line with this vision, Himmler supported the creation of the Lebensborn program in 1936, which established centers where Aryan women could secretly have children out of wedlock to boost birth rates. He also organized gatherings for teenagers to foster heterosexual relationships and discourage homosexuality. In a 1937 speech, he proposed that young people participate in dances to awaken early romantic feelings. In 1940, Himmler separated from Margarete, although he never divorced her out of respect for Gudrun's mother, whom he deeply adored. Despite his growing political responsibilities, he tried to stay close to his daughter, whom he called Pupi. In many childhood photos, Gudrun appears smiling next to her father, with her blonde hair braided and wearing traditional Bavarian outfits, projecting the image of the perfect child according to the Reich's ideals. Himmler, despite his public brutality, tried to be a present and affectionate father in the life of his only legitimate daughter. He made efforts to stay connected with Gudrun, even amidst his hectic political life. He shared details of his daily activities, sent her photographs, and seized any opportunity to spend time with her. His personal agendas reveal almost daily calls with his wife and daughter, filled with notes like "played with the children" or "conversation with Puppy." However, Gudrun's poor grades deeply irritated him, as he believed obedience, cleanliness, and academic performance were fundamental pillars of upbringing. From a young age, Marga also kept a diary recording positive aspects of Gudrun's behavior, but she didn't hide the challenges in ensuring her obedience. When Himmler visited, they often hunted together or took long walks in the woods, fostering a close and affectionate bond. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, also played a significant role in Gudrun's childhood. In 1935, one night, the distressed girl asked her mother if Uncle Hitler would have to die someday. After receiving the reassuring response that he would live for at least 100 years, Gudrun confidently replied, "No, Mum, I know he will live for 200 years." The Himmlers were delighted with the attention Hitler gave Gudrun, who visited him every New Year and received from him a doll and a box of chocolates. Proudly, Marga wrote in her diary on May 3, 1938, "The Führer came." Puppy was very excited. It was wonderful to share the table with him among friends. Gudrun, known as Puppy, spent much of the war alone, cared for by her aunt Lydia Boden, while her mother worked as a nurse for the Red Cross in Berlin. During her travels to occupied territories such as Poland, Marga did not hide her prejudices, describing Jews and Poles in derogatory terms. For her part, Gudrun lived in Gmund, far from the chaos of war, attending school and eagerly awaiting her father's sporadic visits. The girl suffered from stomach aches and nervousness, and her school grades deteriorated. While Himmler wanted his daughter to understand the realities of the conflict, Gudrun was not yet ready to comprehend it. However, her mother noted in her diary that the girl grasped more than she should. During the war, Gudrun lived in constant anticipation, fearing for her father's safety and closely following the developments of the conflict. In July 1944, Gudrun began to understand that defeat was inevitable. Learning about the Normandy landings and the arrival of the Russians at the borders, she tried to convince herself. "Everyone firmly believes in victory, especially father, so as his daughter I am obligated to believe as well. Losing would be unthinkable." That same month, however, Himmler ordered Dachau prisoners to build an air raid bunker in the garden of his home, a sign that the end was near. Gudrun lived in isolation with few playmates and an increasingly irritable mother. Family tensions intensified when Gudrun's cousins, children of Gebhard Himmler, moved into the house in Gmund. Margareta barely tolerated others, further complicating Gudrun's relationships. Throughout the war, Gudrun saw her father between 15 and 20 times, always during brief visits of 3 or 4 days. Contact with him relied on phone calls, letters filled with dedications, and packages with food and gifts like chocolate, cheese, or flowers that he sent even when resources were scarce. On March 5, 1945, Gudrun wrote in her diary with a tone of despair, "In Europe, we no longer have allies. We rely only on ourselves. There is so much betrayal among us." She criticized Göring and Goebbels while lamenting that her father, who always remained in the background, did not receive the recognition he deserved. Gudrun saw Himmler for the last time in November 1944 during a brief 2-day visit to Gmund. Her final phone call with him was in March 1945, and his last letter arrived in April. In their conversations, they spoke about everyday topics or Himmler's health, as he suffered from constant stomach pain. In their final farewell, he told her that he hoped to return for Christmas, though he could not guarantee it. In April 1945, as American troops approached, Margaret and Gudrun left Gmund and headed south. They left behind the bunker built in the garden, a silent remnant of the war nearing its tragic conclusion. On May 13, 1945, 15-year-old Gudrun Himmler and her mother Margarete were detained near Bolzano after being betrayed by Karl Wolff. They were moved to various locations, including Cinecittà in Rome and eventually to Nuremberg. During interrogations, Margarete denied knowledge of her husband's crimes and reacted coldly upon learning of his cyanide suicide on May 23, 1945. Gudrun, isolated and ignorant of her father's activities, stated that they never spoke of the war. Margarete, for her part, expressed pride in Himmler and minimized the regime's atrocities, showing indifference toward the millions of deaths in concentration camps. Her lack of emotion deeply impacted the Allied officers interrogating them. In August 1945, Gudrun Himmler accidentally learned of her father's suicide during an interview with her mother. The news deeply affected her, leaving her bedridden with high fever and delirium for weeks. Convinced that the Allies had murdered him, she refused to accept reality. The British, seeing few options to protect her and unsure of what to do, temporarily gave her the surname Schmidt. Gudrun and her mother remained detained at Camp 77 in Ludwigsburg until 1946. Margaret feared leaving due to the risk of reprisals and the lack of resources. Eventually, they were taken in by Pastor Bodelschwing at a convent where Gudrun kept her distance from the religious community, stating her desire to remain Catholic like her father. In 1952, the two left the convent. Aware of the weight of her surname, Gudrun faced multiple rejections, such as in 1947, when an applied arts school refused to accept her. However, she later managed to enroll thanks to the intervention of a social democratic politician. She decided to train as a seamstress and moved to Munich, distancing herself from her mother. At 21, she attempted to contact her half-siblings, children of Himmler's relationship with Hedwig Potthast, but was unsuccessful. Hedwig, after the war, retreated to Baden-Baden, where she lived discreetly. Little is known about the lives of her children, who grew up far from Gudrun's reach. Gudrun Himmler faced constant rejection due to her surname. She was fired from jobs and evicted from homes, but refused to renounce her father's name, whom she defended throughout her life. In 1955, she participated in fascist events and turned her apartment into a museum dedicated to Heinrich Himmler, collecting objects in his honor. Despite evidence of her father's crimes, she never accepted his guilt and held on to the hope that one day he would be exonerated. In 1951, Gudrun joined the Stille Hilfe Association, which provided legal and logistical support to Nazi criminals. The organization helped figures like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann escape to Latin America. It also contributed to the founding of the Viking Jugend, inspired by the Hitler Youth, which was banned in 1994. Gudrun lived trapped between filial love and denial of her father's role in the atrocities of the Third Reich. Convinced that she was a victim of injustice just like him, Gudrun Himmler dedicated her life to supporting former Nazis and defending the ideals of the Third Reich. As an active member of Stille Hilfe, she aided figures such as Anton Maloth, the cruel guard of the Theresienstadt concentration camp, providing him with refuge in a luxurious retirement home partially funded by German public money. Gudrun visited him regularly until his death in 2002, drawing public criticism. Withdrawing from the world, Gudrun continued defending ex-Nazis, supporting far-right movements like the National Democratic Party of Germany, NPD, and participating in neo-Nazi commemorations. In the 1960s, she married Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, a writer and Nazi sympathizer, with whom she built a family in Munich. Gudrun's great-niece Katrin Himmler took an opposite path. Married to a descendant of a Jewish family, she wrote the book The Himmler Brothers, reflecting on the family's legacy and the atrocities of Nazism, making it clear that the weight of guilt can transcend generations, though Gudrun never showed remorse nor sought to break free from her father's shadow. Edda Goring, between privilege and ruin. Edda Goring, known as the Princess of the Third Reich, was born on June 2, 1938, into an atmosphere of luxury and propaganda. On that day, bells rang throughout the Reich. More than 628,000 congratulatory telegrams were received, and German newsreels announced her birth as a major event. The sublime lady Emmy Göring had given birth to a girl at the West Sanatorium Clinic in Berlin. Hitler, who became her godfather, showed special affection for the little girl and would often welcome her with open arms as Edda took her first steps toward him. After the end of World War II, Edda maintained ties with circles nostalgic for Nazism. For decades, she was a regular guest at gatherings in Bayreuth, at the home of Wagner's descendants, renowned for their affinity with the Third Reich. Despite the passage of time, her home in Munich's Lehel district remained a reference point for German high society. Edda managed to avoid media publicity and cameras, though her name returned to the headlines when she went to court to claim her father's fortune. On the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, Edda filed a legal request with Bavarian authorities, demanding compensation for the inheritance of Hermann Göring, which never came into her possession due to the intervention of the Nuremberg trials. In her petition, she stated, "This is about compensation for the expropriation of my inheritance in 1948, the assets that belonged to my father, which were expropriated posthumously." She added that she was seeking a modest sum to allow her to live with dignity. This was not the first time Edda had sought a portion of her father's legacy. At her christening, she had received personal gifts she considered her property, such as the painting The Virgin and Child by Lucas Cranach the Elder, looted from the Wallraf Richards Museum and gifted to her family by the Cologne City Council. Although she litigated for years over this painting, in 1968 the Federal Court of Germany ruled that its acquisition had been immoral. The playhouse gifted to her by thousands of Luftwaffe officers, built in the forests of Karinhal, and other luxury items also never returned to her hands. Hermann Göring's fortune was monumental. Approximately 1,400 paintings, 250 sculptures, 168 antique tapestries, 60 Persian and French carpets, and thousands of rare books and manuscripts. His art collection, assembled with the help of agents across Europe, included valuable pieces, many obtained through looting. One of his main collaborators was Hildebrand Görlit, father of Cornelius Görlit, who decades later would be discovered with a trove of over 1,400 stolen works of art. In 1954, Edda managed to recover some family jewels using arguments similar to those she presented this time. Now, despite her advanced age, she still retains her aristocratic demeanor, attending court with elegance, reminiscent of the girl who, in her childhood, sat on Hitler's lap. However, the Bavarian parliament unanimously rejected her latest request, following recommendations from the Regional Ministry of Finance. According to journalist Wolfgang Wittel, the reasons behind this new claim remain unclear. Perhaps it is nostalgia for the lost luxury or pressure from those who might inherit from her. What is evident is that Edda Goring, throughout her life, has not abandoned the fight to recover the material and symbolic legacy of her father, though her attempts remain unsuccessful.